Okay, so a few things I want to talk about. First, I watched Michael Knowles lecture at the U of M. I want to comment on that. First, um, I understand his perspective. I don't obviously agree with a lot of it, but I understand it. Um, and I'm sorry that he had to be subjected to these intolerant lefties. If you get a chance, you should see that lecture. It got interrupted many times. Someone tried to assault him, actually a few people in different ways. But suffice to say, the conduct of the lefties was not good. What he had to say was that men are not women. And that, to him and to many, that should not be a controversial subject. I certainly understand why it shouldn't be controversial. It seems pretty fundamental. And yet, I'm transgender, so here we are. Obviously, I disagree because I think that while biologically we're not the same, I think that there's something else going on, and certainly our minds can take on feminine aspects, and if there's enough of a feminine brain, then we can absolutely be genuinely transgender. There are different reasons people identify as transgender. They identify as the gender they weren't born to, or the sex that they weren't born to, right? And so it shouldn't be controversial, but it is. So his statement, by the way, is what got Meghan Murphy banned. And of course, we all know who's ultimately responsible for that. But it shouldn't be controversial, and yet the lefties kick and scream and throw glitter paint and books and everything just to shut him up. They will not stop yelling and crying and throwing a temper tantrum like little children. It is very unbecoming, and it doesn't really demonstrate how really rational and woke the left really is. Because the reality is, no side is more rational than the other, left or right. You can call it progressive, or you can call it regressive, or whatever you want to call the right side, the conservative side, that likes to keep things as they are. So you have the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots want to have more, obviously. But I think it's fair to say, in agreement with Knowles, that they live in fantasy land, because they really don't have a good grasp on reality. These are the kind of people that embrace the Teen Vogue propaganda that a transgender woman is a biological woman, when it's just not true. So it was interesting to watch. I want to apologize to Knowles on behalf of those of us who aren't like this. And I know what you're going to say. If you are transgender or a transgender ally, you're going to be like, Uncle Tom. Well, I don't care what you think, to be honest. You can think I'm an Uncle Tom, but the reality is that I know what I am, and I know what I'm not. And I know that it's in disagreement even with both TRAs, trans rights activists, and the conservatives that reject us as well. I am a biological male. You can call me a man. I'll probably be very cross with you. But I am a biological male who identifies as female and who would like to be treated as such. I do my best to occupy a feminine role. But I realize that I don't have the same capacity. I'm a poor substitute for the real thing, which is to say, if you're a genetic male who would like to produce offspring, I'm not the woman for you. I don't have the same brain. Transgender women generally don't have the same brains as biological females. That's generalizing, of course, because both sexes, there's a huge diversity of neurology, but by and large, we tend to fit certain patterns because nature creates something, or let's put it this way, something in nature ends up working and then it perpetuates itself. If there is no reason for there to be a change, then generally that change doesn't get passed on, right? So generally, we are within a certain tolerance of a certain, we're within a certain range of stereotypical behavior, stereotypical neurology. Anyway, I know that I'm not the same, and I'm okay with that. I'm also doing my best to change some of that. Obviously, many of us take hormone therapy, right? That does affect our neurology, and that's going to change what lights up on the brain scan. But there is, how do I want to say this one? Okay, so this is my view on it. You have, imagine like a city map. You've got roads, right? And you've blazed your trails, you've made your roads, and you've been using them for a very long time, right? Well, after a while, you abandon that town, and or that city or whatever, and then a new population comes in, and some of them use the same roads. A lot of them make their own trails. They blaze their own trails, make their own roads, right? Well, you can still use those other roads, and you will. And so my point to say is sort of like the scars of testosterone, they really do leave stretch marks, or they carve out a path that just doesn't go away. It can erode, it can fade out over time. And one of the things I'd actually like to look into is memory loss. And the reason why I asked that question is because I remember watching on 60 Minutes one of the things that they were talking about was there's a drug called propranolol, and it had an effect on people with PTSD. And people who took this, they suddenly didn't feel as attached to their memories. The emotional value, the triggers, or associations, they just weren't as strong. And so when they revisited these harmful or triggering memories, like really up to a certain point, they were haunted and they couldn't get sleep. It really affected everything. When they started taking this drug, it silenced those neurons, right? And I wonder if this isn't also the case with other chemicals. Like, so I guess this kind of goes into the whole state-dependent memory thing. But when your brain is in a certain state and you start forming memories, right? Associations, but then you are no longer in that state, so you have fewer pathways to get back, maybe. So the reason why I bring this up actually is I don't have the best memory, and I think that me not being under the influence of testosterone, maybe that's why I don't have as strong feelings to old associations that I did. Maybe it's why it's harder to recall certain memories, and I wonder if this isn't the case also with trans men. So I'd like to see some research into memory loss and just even how much hormone therapy for either gender really does affect memory recall, maybe even intelligence. I don't know. I used to joke actually with between trans that estrogen kills brain cells, because I felt like a ditz when I first started getting in hormone therapy. Obviously that's internalized misogyny, but it was in jest. Okay, I forgot where I was going with that, but that was just something I wanted to throw out there. Alright, that aside, what else would I want to talk about? Oh yes, I know what I want to talk about. So let's talk about transitioning kids. I've talked to some people about this, some allies, and the thing I think is interesting is that we're transitioning children when they might not need to be transitioned. I say this because I've come across a number of gays and lesbians who are cisgender. However, when they were younger, they admit that they had questions. And those are the kinds of questions that today, if they were growing up, would probably provoke a conversation with a counselor and then a gender therapist, and then in little time they would find themselves convinced into transitioning. I don't think that most of these kids who are coming out as transgender are legitimately transgender. I don't think, even in general, most people who come out as transgender are actually transgender, and I'll tell you why. At least I can't speak for the FTMs, because I'm not an FTM and I don't have many FTM friends. But in the MTF community, a lot of them are misogynists. There is internalized misogyny, or just outright misogyny. Their ideas of what it means to be a woman is despicably hyper-feminine and submissive. It is everything that a real feminist abhors. It's disgusting. So it's the kind of thing you find very prevalent in the cross-dressing community, but it's becoming prevalent in the transgender community by people who are convinced that they should just go full-time, if you're familiar with that term. So I have questions about those, but I also have a lot of questions about the children. I don't think a lot of these children really should be transitioning. I think that many of them, let's just say this, children are, by and large, up to a certain point, very androgynous in their neurology, in their behaviors, and a lot of what makes them seem typical for their age and their gender is socialization. I'll give you that. A lot of gender is socialization. That means that while you do have hormones that certainly influence your behavior, such as boys tend to be more rowdy because testosterone tends to do that, right? They tend to be rowdy and rough, right? But there's this socialization, and it encourages people to behave one way or the other. However, if you're raised in a gender-neutral environment, it's different, and you'd actually find that boys and girls behave very similarly, but not the same. There are distinct differences. But every now and then you find someone that has feminine interests if they're male, or masculine interests if they're female. And now because people are aware of this phenomenon of transgender children, and because they're scared shitless of being listed as child abusers, now it's on their radar and they want to get them help. Some of them are sincere, and some of them I actually wonder, because I've seen examples where it seems like they care more about their children's transition than their children do. And that's really disturbing. But they generally start off with more gender-neutral brains, and then as they get older, they become more dynamic, and then they start becoming more specialized to be into their more masculine roles or more feminine roles, generally speaking. And so if you try to get them on hormones before that takes place, I get the argument that you want to get these kids on these hormones soon, before these changes take place, specifically because it might traumatize them. Because many of us transgender people have fantasized ever since we were kids about exactly that, getting that opportunity. And so it goes against our own nature to think that you should stop them. But we don't realize we're projecting our experiences onto these children and assuming that they're going through the same thing. And in many cases they're not. But we push it anyway. And so you have these parents doing this, and they push and push, and they listen to counselors who really don't even do any scientific analysis. No brain scans, no blood tests, no anything. We don't know if they're maybe they're intersex. We don't know. We don't care. In fact, one of the defenses, or one of the arguments used to bolster being transgender, is, well, we're probably just intersexed, or we have more of this a neurology more in line with being male or female, whatever our opposite biology is. But we don't actually really care to find out. Certainly, they would say, these advocates would say, these children shouldn't have to go through these batteries of tests because it's cost prohibitive, and we need to get them on these hormone regimens fast before these changes take place. And so they do, and in many cases, sorry, my screen went blank. I'm using a screen as a lighting. Anyway, I've got it on the Google page if you're interested. So they're worried that if these changes take place, that there will be irreparable harm, so they have to get them on these hormones right away. But in many cases, there has been irreparable harm. You've actually had these children grow up and detransition because that wasn't their path for them. They really shouldn't have been there, and they were angry that the people who were supposed to be looking after them led them down that wrong path. They considered it, in retrospect, abuse. So this is my concern. This is what we're doing. So Michael Knowles, in his lecture, talks about them mutilating their bodies. They're rendering these children eunuchs. They're radically transforming their bodies in ways that it goes against nature, right? I don't think he phrased it so just like that, but thing is, it does go against nature. But as an adult, do it. If you feel like you should, if you're compelled to do that, if you can't live in your own skin, do it. Absolutely. But a lot of these kids, they're not even dysphoric. There are a lot of kids who are actually admitting they're not dysphoric. To the point that you have people like Kiss Miss London saying, if you're not gender dysphoric, you're not a transgender, right? Because she feels the need to have to say that. And it makes you wonder, why are they transitioning if they don't have gender dysphoria? Why are they being pushed into this? Why are they being encouraged along this route? A lot of it's peer pressure. A lot of them are, to be frank, they're confused, right? So this is at a time when they're just figuring themselves out. They don't know their ass from a hole in the ground. They don't know who they are. They want to fit in, but they also want to stand out. And they find a group that actually accepts them in the middle of their confusion, and that happens to be an LGBT group. And that could be either in person or online. And online it's actually worse, because then they have fewer human connections, real human connections, and what can be said anonymously with zero consequence, no follow-ups. These kids can end up being irreparably damaged. One of the things that I mentioned in my previous video is that I noticed that on Reddit you have adults talking with children, counseling children who are posting on Reddit about their transitions or their goals to transition. They're encouraging them along this path. I think that's inappropriate. I don't think adults need to be weighing in at all. I think these children, first, they shouldn't even know that that's even a question. If they're really legitimately transgender, hopefully there will be people that will spot it and might be able to help them. But the reality is a lot of them are being pushed into it by their peers and by just curiosity. Maybe they saw something online because of more awareness of being transgender. They Googled it, and then because it happens to be at a time of their life when they are questioning everything, even their own identity. Which, of course, when you're a kid, when you're a teenager, identity is everything, right? You need to stand out, so you have to forge an identity for yourself. That's when you're the most vulnerable. These children are the most psychologically vulnerable now more than ever. Their brains are shaped. I really think that social media is actually conditioning their brains to be ready for this kind of, I don't want to say brainwashing, but some of it seems like brainwashing. It's very affirmative, and there is a lot of misinformation. So it confirms bias. People who don't even know they don't know the first thing about psychology, and yet they're telling these children that their feelings are justified. They're not counseling them. They're not asking them what's going on in your life. Why are you asking these questions? They're just telling them, yeah, go ahead and do it. This is obviously your path in life. So that's a real concern to me. So I think social media absolutely needs to take a stand on this. I think adults absolutely need to put the brakes on transitioning their children. I think that society it's so strange, because years ago, maybe, what was it, around the time I first started my transition, it wasn't like this. I was lost, I was confused. There was affirmation, there was confirmation bias. There were people encouraging me along a path that, for all they knew, was the wrong path for me. For all they knew, I'd end up killing myself over it. But it wasn't so embraced, and that's because the TRAs, trans rights activists, and the LGBT community at large, who I think actually is using us for political reasons, they've made a lot of gains, and they have somehow managed to trick society into believing that there are 5 lights. There are 4 lights, but they're saying there are 5 lights. They are telling society that they're convincing society that most transgender people are legitimate, or all of them are legitimate. They're convincing them that biology, there's no such thing as biological gender. Basically, you have people saying that there are essentially infinite genders, or there are no genders. And that's not the case. It's really, a lot has changed in a little bit of time, to the point that it's disturbed me, a trans woman who has been pretty silent on the issue for a while. I used to be more adamant, and I used to make regular videos about what it meant to be transgender, and now I'm really, really needing to speak up, because it seems like my community has gotten out of hand, because the vocal minority is speaking up and speaking over and bullying all the rational trans people into submission, bullying them into being quiet. That's terrifying. So I'm reaching out. I'm finding allies, people who are not delusional, people who realize that, yeah, we could be wrong. Being transgender, we could absolutely be wrong, but we're still going to do our thing, right? But we're not going to push it. And I think that's fair. It's absolutely a fair take. Let's not push our ideology. If you want to push legislation for protections to a point, sure. Just not the point where you start alienating other people's rights. And I suppose I'll save that for another video. I'll get more into that later. It's been almost 25 minutes, 23 minutes, 49 seconds at this point. I'm not going to take up your time too much longer, so I'm just going to end it here, and I'll try to make another video sometime soon.